You are listening to The Evidence Locker. Today's episode is brought to you by BetterHelp, the world's largest e-counseling platform. Our cases have been researched using open source and archived materials. It deals with true crimes and real people. Each episode is produced with the utmost respect to the victims, their families, and loved ones. Australia in the early 1980s was a great place to go backpacking. Pristine beaches, vibrant cities, and laid-back Aussie lifestyle lured countless young people to its shores. It was the era of the Thornbirds, Men at Work, Olivia Newton-John, a period that gave inspiration for the creation of Crocodile Dundee. It was safe to travel around the vast country, and groups of young friends made their way around in cars, by buses or trains, as well as hitching rides whenever they could. In May 1982, 20-year-old Tony Jones did what many young Australians did. He rounded up a couple of mates and embarked on the adventure of a lifetime. Instead of heading off to Europe or America, he decided to backpack his way through Australia. They took the anti-clockwise route from Perth, heading to Adelaide. Then he touched base in Melbourne, Canberra, and Sydney before arriving in Brisbane in September. By this time, his friends decided to head back to Perth, but Tony wanted to keep on traveling. His 22-year-old brother Tim was on an adventure of his own, cycling across the country. The brothers met up and traveled together. While Tim cycled, Tony hitchhiked. It was in the time before cell phones, social media, and internet cafes, so to communicate, Tony and Tim called home using payphones and left messages for each other arranging when and where to meet up. This system was working pretty well for them. The familiarity of a brother to keep you in check while having the freedom to explore in your own way. Until Tony failed to show up at Mount Isa as they had arranged. At first, Tim thought Tony was simply struggling to hitch a ride from Townsville. But after a couple of days had passed with no sign of Tony, he knew something must have happened to his little brother. A backpacker lost in the Australian outback is not easy to find. And in 1982, there were even more challenges than there would be today. The Jones family had been relentless in their search for Tony. And today, almost 40 years later, they seem closer to finding answers than ever. What happened to Tony Jones? Anthony John Jones, or Tony as his family called him, was born on the 3rd of July, 1962 in Perth, Western Australia. He was the youngest of 7 children, and the family was close. Dad Kevin and Mom Barris always kept a close eye on all of them. No matter where they were or what they did, the Jones kids regularly called home to check in. When Tony was 7 years old, he went missing from his family home. His parents and siblings searched everywhere and eventually found his little unconscious body locked in a disused fridge in the garage. It was a terrible accident, and fortunately, Tony was okay. Since that day, the whole family was diligent in letting each other know where they were at any given time. Every year, they remembered the day when Tony nearly lost his life and gave thanks that things turned out all right. Tony's family described him as gentle and cheeky. He had an insatiable sense of adventure and always wanted to travel. He loved spending time with Natalie Morris, his childhood sweetheart. When Tony told her about an extended trip, she understood that he wasn't trying to get away from her. That wasn't the case at all. Tony was simply listening to the call of the open road. He promised he would call her often, and that he would be back before Christmas. 6 months into the trip, after visiting all of Australia's big cities, Tony and his brother Tim started making their way back to Perth via the top end. The Jones brothers met up in Mackay, then Airlie Beach, entrance to the Great Barrier Reef, before spending some time in Townsville, far north Queensland. In Townsville, Tony and Tim shared a trailer with other travelers at Sun City Caravan Park and Rossley. The plan was to make their way to Mount Isa from there, a 435-mile trip inland. It's on the way to Perth, and the brothers were positive that they would make it home for Christmas, as planned. Tim went ahead, and they arranged that Tony would meet up with him in Mount Isa a week later. By Tony's calculations, if he got lucky with a ride, it wouldn't have taken more than 2 days hitchhiking to get to Mount Isa, so he decided to go to Cairns first. He left Townsville on Thursday, October 28th. By all accounts, he had a good time in Cairns, but when he was ready to leave, he struggled to find a lift back to Townsville. He was also running out of money and had to sleep out on the beach for a couple of nights, hoping the next day would bring him someone who would take him along the 4-hour ride back to Townsville. He finally returned to the Sun City Caravan Park on Wednesday the 3rd of November, where he touched base with some travelers he'd met the week before. He knew Tim was expecting him in Mount Isa the following day, so he went to a phone booth on the corner of Bowen Road near the Caravan Park around 7:30 p.m. to call home. Tony was surprised to learn that his brother was already waiting for him in Mount Isa. Tim had informed them that he was strapped for cash and was hoping Tony would arrive soon. Tony went into the bank almost daily, drawing small amounts, less than $10, just to see him and sometimes Tim through the day. Their mother, Barris Jones, had deposited $150 into Tony's account for the brothers to share, and Tony promised he would catch up with his brother as soon as he could. It was the last conversation his family ever had with Tony. He also called Natalie and seemed upbeat and excited about being home for Christmas. When he was not seen around Townsville any further, fellow travelers at the caravan park assumed that he had left for Mount Isa that night. Tony was never seen or heard from ever again. Tim estimated that it would take Tony a day or two to make his way to Mount Isa, so when he didn't show up after 3 days, he called the Jones family home in Perth to hear if his brother had left a message. Tim was worried because Tony was reliable. He would not have kept him waiting for so long, especially knowing that he needed money. Their mother called the bank and learnt that Tony never accessed the money she had deposited. At the time she made the payment, Tony only had $3 in his account, so he would not have wasted any time in making it to the bank. Tony's family called his girlfriend Natalie to hear if she had any news from Tony, but she didn't. It was very unusual because throughout his trip, Tony had been very diligent in calling her. At this point, they knew he was in trouble. We'll take a quick break for a word from our sponsors. Is there something interfering with your happiness or is preventing you from achieving your goals? Although I was in a good place, I felt it would be good for me to take stock and see where I could make changes to make things better. I reached out to BetterHelp. They assessed my needs and matched me with my very own licensed professional therapist. I spoke to Edward, who helped me develop a routine that would make me a little bit more impactful. I love that it gives me a sense of accountability, and I can check in at any time to discuss my progress or my struggles. With BetterHelp, you can start communicating in under 24 hours. It's not a crisis line, it's not self-help. It is professional counseling done securely and privately online. There is a broad range of expertise in BetterHelp's counselor network, which may not be locally available in many areas. What's good about BetterHelp is that the service is available for clients worldwide, whenever you need it. You can log into your account anytime and send a message to your counselor. You'll get timely and thoughtful responses. Plus, you can schedule weekly video or phone sessions so you won't ever have to sit in an uncomfortable waiting room as with traditional therapy. BetterHelp is committed to facilitating great therapeutic matches, so they make it easy and free to change counselors if needed. It's more affordable than traditional offline counseling, and financial aid is available. BetterHelp wants you to start living a happier life today. Visit their website and read their testimonials that are posted daily, like this one. Cortina has got the heart of things and helped me to face demons that have been around most of my life. She is friendly, professional, courteous, and non-judgmental. Thank you, Cortina. Visit betterhelp.com/evidence. That's better, H-E-L-P, and join the over 700,000 people taking charge of their mental health with the help of an experienced professional. Evidence Locker listeners can get 10% off their first month at betterhelp.com/evidence. Now, back to today's episode. Question beckoned. Did Tony Jones stay in Townsville on Wednesday night, the 3rd of November, with the intention of going to the bank the following morning to withdraw money before he left for Mount Isa? Or did he find a lift that same night and decided to go to the bank at his destination? The fact that Tim needed money meant that Tony would have been in a hurry to get to him in Mount Isa. So if someone offered him a lift, he probably would have jumped at the opportunity rather than wait for the bank to open the following day. Remember, this was in the 1980s, and ATMs weren't a 24-hour service. Tony's family called Townsville police to report him missing, but was struggling to get through to the right person. The fact that he was a 20-year-old male backpacker made police believe that he was safe and that his absence was a case of miscommunication. They thought Tony would resurface soon enough, so nothing much was done about it. But Tony's family knew something wasn't right, and decided to take the 3-day journey from Perth to Queensland to look for him. When they arrived in Townsville, they went to the police station to make an official missing persons report. By this time, it had been 11 days since they had last spoken to him. A lot of valuable evidence and possible leads were missing because of this delay. The family felt from the get-go that police were not doing enough in searching for Tony. Police even told them to go home to Perth because Tony was probably aiming to be home for Christmas. The Joneses knew that he would have been in contact if he could. So they took it upon themselves to canvass the area where Tony was last seen and knocked on doors with a photo of Tony and asked if anyone had any information. The family's door-to-door canvassing took place without any assistance from the police. Talking to locals, it was a shock to learn how many people went missing in the outback. They had to come to terms with the fact that with every passing day, chances of ever finding Tony alive were getting slimmer. Consider that in 2018, the Australian Federal Police were dealing with 2,600 unsolved missing persons cases. An average 38,000 people are reported missing in Australia every year. 98% of missing persons end up found. The other 2% is not so lucky. Back in 1982, searching for Tony in the expansive outback was like looking for the proverbial needle in a haystack. All of the Jones family members and his girlfriend, Natalie, decided to write down the details of their last conversations with Tony. Perhaps there were clues in something he had said. His brother Mark recalled that Tony mentioned lifts were hard to come by. It took him much longer to get back to Townsville from Cairns than he had anticipated. He also joked and told his brother to make sure his room was ready and waiting when he arrived back in Perth. After an extensive search, the family could not find any sign of Tony in Townsville, which made them believe he may have left for Mount Isa soon after his last phone call. The A6 Flinders Highway between Townsville and Mount Isa would have been the best route to travel. It is also known as the Highway of Death, due to the high amount of violent, deadly, and unsolved incidents over the years. The first recorded murders were in 1970, when 7-year-old Judith Mackay and her 5-year-old sister Susan were raped and stabbed to death at Anthill Plains Creek. Their bodies were found on a dried-out riverbed, 25 kilometers southwest of Townsville. The lead detective in the case vowed that he would not go home until they had a suspect. He spent day and night at the police station and questioned everyone around town, feverishly looking for answers. But it took its toll, and he died of a heart attack 2 weeks later. Teenage friends Robin Hoynville Bartram and Anita Cunningham disappeared along Flinders Highway in 1972. Robin's body was discovered under a rail bridge at Sensible Creek with multiple bullet holes to the head. Anita had never been found and has remained a missing person. In 1975, teenager Catherine Graham's body was found at the same location as Judith and Susan Mackay, 500 meters away from the exact spot. Police did not have much evidence to go on, and the killer remained free. Then Tony disappeared. As in the other cases, police had no idea who could have taken him. They appealed to the public for information, and it paid off. 2 months after the last sighting of Tony, law enforcement received a letter simply signed Lochiel and posted from Cairns. It read, "I believe body of A.J. Jones buried in or near Fullerton Riverbed within 100 yards Southside Flinders Highway, Lochiel." The handwritten note was scribbled and first wrote that the body was 100 yards west of the highway, but the word west was scratched out and corrected to south side. Police searched the area between Cloncurry and Julia Creek for 2 days but could not find anything. They concluded that the so-called Lochiel letter was a hoax. It is significant to note that it was sent from Cairns, the last place Tony visited before returning to Townsville, days before he vanished. Tony's family also wondered how the writer knew Tony's initials, as they were never made public. After 6 months had passed and there was still no sign of Tony, police had to concede that he was probably no longer alive. Police offered a $20,000 reward for information that would lead them to Tony. By this time, the general assumption was that he had met with foul play, and police investigated his case as a homicide. Although the investigation into Tony's disappearance was not making any headway, his family never stopped looking for him. They checked in with Townsville police often, and shared any information that they found along the way. News of Tony's disappearance was widely publicized, and the whole country followed the case over the years. In 1987, his brother Brian's book called Searching for Tony was published, detailing the family's search for answers. Brian was also the driving force behind Australia's National Missing Persons Week, inspired by the disappearance of his little brother. Missing Persons Week is held annually during the first week of August and gives families of vanished loved ones the opportunity to keep their loved ones' stories in the media. It was at a memorial service for Tony in Townsville in 1988 that the Jones family launched the very first Missing Persons Week. Sadly, Beres Jones, Tony's mother, passed away in 1990, 8 years after he vanished, without ever knowing what happened to her son. Her family says she was heartbroken about Tony's disappearance to her dying day. 10 years after his disappearance in 1992, police released the identity of a possible suspect. A witness told police that he had seen Tony at the Rising Sun Hotel in Townsville with this person. The unidentified man had offered Tony a place to stay the night. The suspect bore an uncanny resemblance to former Charters Towers police superintendent Mervyn Stevenson, who retired from the force a year before Tony's disappearance. He retired under a cloud of suspicion regarding corruption and misconduct. Stevenson's name came up during the 2001 inquest, but only to confirm that he was never questioned with regards to Tony's disappearance. He also died in 2001, so the opportunity to question him was lost forever. A police sketch artist created a second sketch that did not quite resemble the first one. In the second drawing, the man has a square jawline as opposed to the pointed oval shape of the first sketch. Some leads came in, but none were strong enough to help police make an arrest. Two names kept popping up after the second sketch was released. Local men going by the names Pickering and Douglas were pointed out as persons of interest. But by the time police followed up, 7 years after the first tip, neither of them was alive. Things were not moving along in the investigation. It would take 6 more years. 6 years during which investigators were reassigned, and new investigators had to start from scratch. But the Jones family refused to give up. The family took it upon themselves to interview people, always hoping to find the truth. A retired grazier, that's a colloquial term for a cattle farmer, from Cloncurry, a town about an hour and a half's drive east of Tony's intended destination of Mount Isa, had intriguing information. He said that shortly after Tony's disappearance, he was with a friend, a retired police officer, when they found abandoned camping gear at a location just outside of town. Among the things was a letter from Tony's mom. The ground was disturbed. It looked like there had been a scuffle. It was almost like someone had dragged a body through the dirt. The farmer said they handed the items into police and told them about the scene, but they were never contacted about it again. The Jones family asked the retired farmer if he would inform the coroner about this evidence. There was no trace of it in the case file, so the coroner ordered an excavation of the campsite where Tony's belongings were found some 20 years before. Sadly, the search party of 8 police officers together with 4 volunteers from the State Emergency Service, or SES, could not find anything that connected the site to Tony Jones. In the time since the farmer and the cop found the evidence, the area had been ravaged by multiple bushfires and floods. Any evidence would have been destroyed in the passage of 20 years. At the coronial inquest in February 2002, 20 years after Tony vanished, Coroner Ian Fisher concluded that Tony was the victim of a homicide, despite the fact that his body was never found. Coroner Fisher said, "I am satisfied that the missing person is dead. I find that he died on or around the 3rd of November 1982 at the hands of a person or persons unknown." After the inquest, Tony's brother Tim addressed the media and said, "Either Tony got a lift as far as Cloncurry that night and decided to pitch his tent on the outskirts of town, or he came to grief earlier, and this person had some belongings, and he was the one who pitched the tent." In Queensland, a death certificate cannot be issued if the coroner is unable to determine the place of death. Because of this, although he was assumed dead, Tony had not been declared deceased until 2006, when Queensland Minister of Justice changed legislation. She felt that the Jones family had suffered enough and a death certificate would at least give a minimal amount of closure in one of the country's most baffling unsolved cases. In February 2008, Queensland prisons received decks of cold case playing cards so that inmates could use them during leisure time. The hope was that someone had information about unsolved cases. Tony's information was printed on the 2 of spades, with the increased reward of $250,000 offered. After the inquest documents were released to the Jones family, they pored over it, reading and rereading every single detail. It didn't take them long to find a couple of leads that had never been adequately explored by Queensland police. The family requested that the case be reopened, but did not receive a response. They petitioned Attorney General Cameron Dick and had to wait for more than a year to get an answer. In September 2010, Queensland launched the campaign Walk a Day in My Shoes, an attempt to get more support at the polls. Tony's brother Brian Jones sent the Attorney General a pair of Tony shoes and challenged him to walk a day in the shoes of a crime victim. The very next day, the Jones family heard the news that the case had been reopened. The renewed investigation was also riddled with problems. Investigators were reassigned, and a new team had to start from scratch yet again. Investigators homed in on one detail, though. At the time of Tony's disappearance, he carried a firearm in his backpack. The dismantled .22 caliber rifle with the dark red stock has never been found. They felt that if they could locate the weapon, it would lead them to Tony's killer. However, in the early days of the investigation, the picture released to the media was of another type of rifle. They blew any chance of receiving useful information because of this error. Despite that, a man came forward who claimed his brother-in-law had given him a gun. The brother-in-law was already a person of interest in the investigation. Officers mistakenly showed him the wrong picture yet again, and the witness said that he didn't recognize a firearm. Because of that, the statement was thrown out. Officers working on the reopened case were tasked with finding the missing evidence, including the evidence given by the grazier from Cloncurry, but never found anything. In October 2011, an ex-convict came forward and told police that during his time in Townsville Correctional Center, his cellmate told him that he did a blokeout near Mount Isa. Following up on prison records, investigators found the name of the cellmate, Michael James Landis. They located him in Perth, but they never spoke to him. A year before the second inquest took place, he passed away. The only suspect they had did not live to explain the alleged comments he made to his cellmate in the prison in Townsville. After his death, Landis' brother came forward and said that he suspected his brother was the one who wrote the Lochiel letter. He said his brother suffered from bipolar disorder and was drawn to violence. He provided police with a sample of Landis' handwriting for comparison, but if it matched or not, that information has never been made public. On the 8th of February 2014, Senior Sergeant John Mahoney released information to the public that there was new, fresh and credible information that linked Tony to a specific town. Within the same week, a team of investigators arrived in Hughenden to question residents. Hughenden is a small cattle and sheep town in North Queensland, with about 1,000 residents. It is halfway between Townsville and Mount Isa on the A6 Flinders Highway. Rumors were doing the rounds in Hughenden, saying that Tony was killed near the town and his remains were burnt and then strewn over a large area. Police could not ignore this, seeing as information from as far back as 1983 linked Tony to the town. Multiple witnesses came forward, saying they saw a young hitchhiker fitting Tony's description in Hughenden between 12th and the 14th of November, 10 days after he was last seen. There was an issue of inconsistency regarding the identity of the hitchhiker, however. One witness said that he thought the young man was of Aboriginal descent, while another felt that he was Italian. Tony Jones had a fair complexion. One woman, a credible witness, remembered seeing him at the Grand Hotel on November 12th around 8 p.m. She described him as having an Abraham Lincoln-style beard, as can be seen on the photo of Tony on missing persons flyers. However, police were informed that Tony had shaved his beard shortly before his disappearance and concluded that the man seen in Hughenden could not have been Tony. But if 10 days had passed since he was last seen, it was possible that it had grown back. These inconsistencies were enough to make investigators abandon the Hughenden thread of the investigation back in the 80s. However, more witnesses came forward after the first inquest, and a second inquest in 2010 heard that Tony possibly met his demise in Hughenden. With the information about Hughenden, there was enough reason to investigate further. Two men who lived in the area around the time of Tony's disappearance were at the forefront of the investigation. By 2014, police were so confident about the new information that after 4 days of on-the-ground investigation, Detective Acting Superintendent Cheryl Scanlon announced that Tony Jones might have been killed in the town of Hughenden. The two men suspected by police are Kevin Wright and Johnny Eastoff. They were childhood friends who grew up in the North Queensland cattle town. In 1982, the teenaged Wright and Eastoff were known around town as big drinkers who loved picking fights. Wright was working as an apprentice butcher at his father's slaughterhouse. Eastoff boarded at Townsville Grammar School, but his parents still resided in Hughenden, so he often made the trip home from Townsville. An ex-girlfriend of Kevin Wright's, Jerry Stanfield, came forward in recent years and said that Wright had confessed to her when he was very drunk. She said Wright told her that when they were 17, Eastoff punched a young truck driver next to the road and broke his neck. A distraught Eastoff went to Wright's house in the middle of the night and asked him for help. The pair then went to pick the trucker's body up to where Eastoff had left him, took him to the slaughterhouse and cut his body up using a bandsaw. As part of Wright's butcher training, he was required to cut up animal carcasses and boil the meat off the bone in large copper pots before burning the bones in one of many fire pits in the slaughter yard. Doing the same to a human body would not have been too difficult. When Kevin Wright found out that his ex-girlfriend had spoken to police, he forced her to retract the statement. Fearing for her safety, as well as the safety of her children, she complied. But Hughenden police were about to receive another visit. This time, from Kevin Wright's ex-partner of 18 years and mother of his children, Natalie Parker. Natalie told police that he often alluded to something sinister that took place when he was a teenager. She said Wright told her that he and Johnny had done things together and that nobody ever found out about. Natalie knew they had done something to a backpacker. Wright was hysterically drunk whenever he spoke about it. Natalie also painted the picture of Wright as a violent and dangerous man who often boasted that he could get away with murder. She was reluctant to come forward at the time. She was fearing for her own life and did not want to leave her children without a mother. Melissa Bell, a friend of Kevin Wright and Natalie Parker, said that Wright broke down in the back of a taxi after a night of heavy drinking in 2012. He cried and said, "Johnny and me murdered a backpacker, poured petrol on him and burnt him at the slaughter yard in Hughenden, and the body would never be found." Everyone knew that Johnny was Wright's friend, John Eastoff. Melissa told Natalie about the confession, and that's when they decided to go to the police. Most people who knew Wright and Eastoff said that Eastoff was the dominant one of the two, and that Wright always went along with what he said since they were kids. Whenever Wright confessed, he was drunk. He was haunted by the memory, tormented, sometimes even rocking in the fetal position and crying. Then, there was yet another testimony. This one from Johnny Eastoff's ex-wife, Jennifer Crisp. It took her more than 20 years to break her silence. She suffered severe domestic violence at the hands of her husband. He threatened her and said that if he killed her, he would get away with it. He was too smart. He would make sure he wouldn't get caught. These witness testimonies did align for the most part, although there were some contradictions. Wright told Natalie Parker that Eastoff's victim was a backpacker. Melissa Bell was told he was a hitchhiker, and Jerry Stanfield was under the impression he was a truck driver. However, that isn't enough to throw the alleged confessions out. Over the years, Tony's missing persons case was very well publicized in the Hughenden area. Perhaps Wright needed to get it off his chest, but didn't describe the victim as a backpacker, seeing as everyone would have known who it was immediately. Perhaps he felt that Natalie, who was his partner for 18 years and mother of his children, would never turn on him. But after they split up and some time went by, she felt confident enough to do the right thing and tell police about his drunken confessions. It was a fact that Eastoff boarded in Townsville at the time and frequently took the Flinders Highway home to Hughenden. It's very plausible that he gave Tony a lift from Townsville on the night of November 3rd, 1982. If something went wrong that caused Tony's death, there was only one person he trusted enough to help him: Kevin Wright. The fact that Wright had experience in animal dismemberment and had access to the slaughter yards was very convenient. Both Eastoff and Wright appealed to the Supreme Court to avoid giving evidence. They lost the appeal in 2016, before the scheduled inquest on August 2016 in Townsville. Eastoff took the stand and testified that Jerry Stanfield had told him about Wright's confessions, and she asked him if it was true. He strongly denied it, and that he had ever killed anyone, and was so confused as to why Wright would say something like that he ended their friendship. At the inquest, Wright's son Cale testified that his father was drunk one night, and that he told him he had done something. In a statement made 2 years before, the record stated that Cale said his dad said he had done something bad. In 2016, Cale challenged that statement, saying he only ever said something, not something bad, and that police must have added the word bad. He also said that he was under the impression that his father was at butcher school in Brisbane at the time of Tony's disappearance. But the hue and thread of the investigation was not the only matter discussed at the 2016 inquest. Police incompetence was blamed for a botched investigation. The coroner stated that the investigating officer was uncooperative when he came knocking at his door many years later, inquiring about missing evidence. The Jones family found various leads that could have solved the case, had it been investigated at the time. Firstly, the dental records in Tony's file did not belong to Tony. Even if they had found his remains, they would not have been able to match it to Tony. Because the family provided records to police in the 1980s before the digital era, there was no backup. Tony's original dental records have never resurfaced, which means identifying his remains using this method will never be possible. Police didn't follow up on alibi statements of key suspects. It was Tony's family who managed to track down a former classmate on one of the suspects who blew a hole in the suspect's alibi. The Jones family also requested DNA testing to be done on the Lockyer letter in recent years. At first, police said that it had not been stored correctly and it was not possible to extract a DNA profile. However, when the family insisted that they try again, police were forced to admit that they had lost the letter. Another letter was mentioned in an internal police memo. Because this is an ongoing investigation, we cannot reveal names and descriptions, but here is the gist of it. I have also received a letter from a retired grazier who has named a suspect by the name of X. And I note that his history indicates he is most probably a Y. And I consider that he should be interviewed. I have attached a copy of the letter. However, this letter and the grazier's statement were missing from the original inquest. The only remaining evidence is the memo, written by one of the officers on the homicide squad. Coroner Fisher conceded that the investigation should have received more urgent attention during the early stages. A royal commission into police misconduct followed, eventuating in the conviction of the police commissioner at the time of Tony's disappearance, Terry Lewis, for corruption. The inquest found that Queensland police of the 1980s were, quote, debilitated by misconduct, inefficiency, incompetence, and deficient leadership, end quote. Of course, none of this would bring Tony back. But at least there was some recourse for what can, at best, be described as a neglectful investigation. Detective Senior Sergeant Chris Lill, who was part of the investigation for 15 years, tried to explain why police attitude regarding Tony's case was so slack. He said this in a report to the coroner. Rightly or wrongly, missing persons over the age of 16 years did not attract or command the deployment or availability of resources as they would have in this day and age. Sadly, the 2016 inquest had to be halted halfway through, when lawyers realized that it was being heard under the antiquated 1956 Coroners Act as opposed to the revised legislation of 2003. If the whole inquest was heard under the disused act, it could be problematic in future criminal prosecution. The allegations against Wright and Eastoff were compelling, but there was not sufficient evidence to charge the men. After years of incompetent investigation, police could not simply accept that they were the most likely suspects. But if they were not involved in Tony's disappearance, then who was? In 2014, a man came forward and claimed to be one of Australia's most prolific serial killers. Andy Albury, also known as Australia's Hannibal Lecter, boasted of killing 14 people in the area between Townsville and Mount Isa between 1970 and 1983. He said that Tony Jones was one of his victims. At an inquest, he stated that Tony will stay buried where I planted him. Arbery was known to indulge in media attention, and many people believed that he only confessed to Tony's murder so he could be in the spotlight again. He struggled with mental illness, and some of his confessions did not add up. If Arbery was responsible for all the murders he claimed to have committed, he must have been 9 years old when he started killing. And although he confessed to killing more than 12 hitchhikers, he could not give any information about the murders. Of course, Australia has had its fair share of serial killers. In June 1987, German tourist Joseph Schwab went on a 10-day killing spree in the top end of Australia, taking the lives of 5 people. His victims were usually in nature spots, fishing or hiking, and the attacks were random and heartless. Schwab was killed during a shootout with police and took his motive for the murders to the grave. Wolf Creek was largely inspired by Schwab's murderous rampage. Some people wondered if he could have been active on the Flinders Highway in earlier years. Law enforcement was able to establish that Schwab, a German national, had lived in Adelaide, South Australia, working as a cabinet maker between 1981 and 1984, on the opposite side of the country. He went back to Germany and only returned in 1987, 2 months before his killing spree kicked off. They did not think it was plausible that Schwab had anything to do with Tony's or any of the other unsolved cases in North Queensland. Serial killer Ivan Milat only began his heinous career as a serial killer in the late 1980s and lived and worked in New South Wales, nowhere near the location where Tony was last seen. If you ask the Jones family, they believe that Kevin Wright and Johnny Eastoff are behind Tony's murder, and it's a matter of time before the police make an arrest. Wright lives in Townsville now and owns a concreting business. Eastoff also lives in Townsville. They have not been in touch. Both men still deny the accusations of murder and claim they had nothing to do with Tony's disappearance and presumed death. In 2018, the Jones family came forward and said that earlier suspicions about 2 men from Hughenden had been confirmed. They believe that Tony was offered a lift as far as Hughenden on the night of November 3rd with a group of young people. Something went wrong, resulting in Tony's murder, and 2 of the men disposing of Tony's body in an outback slaughterhouse. Today, Tony's dad, Kevin, is in his 90s and desperate to find out what happened to his son. The inquest is still in progress, and one can only hope that justice will prevail. Tony's siblings have vowed to keep on looking until they get the answers about what happened to their little brother with the big smile and insatiable lust for life. If you have information that may assist police regarding Tony Jones, please call Crime Stoppers Australia on 1800-333-000 or follow the link in the show notes. We'd like to thank today's sponsors, BetterHelp. To get 10% off your first month, go to betterhelp.com/evidence. If you'd like to read more about this case, have a look at the resources used for this episode in the show notes. Also, visit and like our Facebook page at facebook.com/Evidence Locker Podcast to see more about today's case. If you like our podcast, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. We would also appreciate it if you could review the episodes, as it gives us some street cred in the world of podcasting. This was the Evidence Locker. Thank you for listening.